So the Tories have taken an absolute pasting in the local elections. They've lost over 1,000 seats, underperforming some of their worst expectations. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. But on the other hand, Labour maybe haven't done as well as they need to in order to win the next election. They've won just over 500 seats. So they're certainly not gobbling up everything that the Tories have lost. Rakib, what have you made of that? I mean, particularly in terms of Labour and where they need to be.
Well, firstly, there's no way that you can spin the reality that it was an absolutely disastrous performance provided by the Conservative Party to lose over 1,000 councillors. And quite often it's your energetic councillors who are your foot soldiers, organisational foot soldiers when it comes to general election campaigns. And I think the reality is quite often when a councillor loses his or her seat, that kind of energy in terms of representing the party when it comes to general election time, it's not necessarily there when they've lost their seats so recently. But I think in terms of Labour, I think Labour will be encouraged by the fact that it gained control and it wrestled control from the Tories when it came to councils, which are Brexit voting authorities, especially in the provincial Midlands. I'm thinking of local authorities such as Amber Valley, Erewash, both of those local authorities in Derbyshire. They had a very good performance in Broxtowe in Nottinghamshire, where they gained 12 councillors, Labour, 10 were from the Tories, but also 2 from the Liberal Democrats, probably one of their most impressive performances in the local elections. But I agree. I think Sir Keir Starmer needs to leave the bubbly on ice. I think there was a great deal of triumphalism coming out of the Labour Party. I'm not sure. I'm not so sure. I think there's a great deal of work that needs to be done by the party if it wants to secure a workable parliamentary majority. And I do think that we have to entertain the possibility of there perhaps being a Labour Liberal Democratic coalition, a Liberal Democrat coalition in the following the next general election. I think that's certainly a possibility. And we have to make the point. I think that the Greens, they had a fantastic time of it. I think that if you see in recent local election cycles, they've been building on a series of impressive performances. And I'd actually say they were the biggest winners of these latest local elections in England.
And in terms of how the results are being spun, obviously, Rakib, that you're absolutely right. There's no good way to spin it for the Tories. What an absolute disaster. But Keir Starmer's line is not only, essentially to say the election's in the bag, but also he seems to think that he's won the culture war. Mm-hmm. He had this interesting phrase. He said, the NHS trumps woke every day of the week, as if to imply, the way the Tories are focusing on trans issues or migration is a big turnoff for voters. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, no, not at all, not least because of the fact that the idea that Rishi Sunak was going up and down the country demanding to know of Labour councillors if they knew what a woman was. That's not how local elections work. It would be absurd if you tried to mount a campaign on that particular basis. He was literally photographed filling in potholes because that's what we're dealing with when you're talking about local elections. But I think that comment in particular speaks to the sense of complacency, the idea that he's neutralised the issues which were really dogging him for a very long time and will continue to, I dare say, despite his electoral prospects looking up at this particular juncture. And especially given the fact that, yes, it was a bad night for the Conservatives. It was probably always going to be a bad night for the Conservatives. They've been in power for a very long time. And they have had also their kind of most incredibly self-immolating year when they've gone through 3 prime ministers and all sorts of different things. It's worth, of course, remembering that they have squandered the opportunities that was presented them by 2019 and Brexit, as evidenced by those Leave voters going back to Labour, potentially not because I think they've changed their minds on that particular issue, but it feels like a dead issue, not least because of how much the Tories have completely screwed it up.
And they've allowed it to be buried as well.
Exactly. And that's something which I think will be one to watch. I think the problem for Starmer is that it's that kind of sense of complacency because at the current state of play, it's quite clear that whilst people are running away from Conservatives, or at least a certain number of voters are, they're not necessarily running headlong excitedly towards Keir Starmer. He's not someone who sets pulses racing. It was interesting to hear him talk about the NHS trumps woke every time. I mean, what is his plan for the NHS or anything else for that matter? I mean, in recent days, it seems that his main policy is to say that he's going to look at what Tories have done and maybe change it or not. I mean, he's still kind of dodging a lot of those particular issues. And also complacency on the culture war, I think, is important to talk about because of the fact that you have this very deadening discussion, which is to say, wow, actually, the number one issue for people is the cost of living. Of course it is. It would be insane if it wasn't, given how bad things are out there at the moment. People's bread and butter issues are always going to be front and centre in their minds. The thing about the culture war and the reason it's so important is that it kind of underlines a lot of those other discussions. It kind of sits behind them in a weird sort of way. It's one of the ways in which, in quite a profound way, there's been this kind of rupture between ordinary people and their elected representatives to the point where they feel that their leaders have completely strange, exotic, nonsensical worldviews around gender or anything else. It kind of expresses that chasm between ordinary people and the people vying for their particular attention. And all it would take is for a particular issue to polarize around those culture war issues for it to be very troubling for Keir Starmer. So, of course, it's not. No one was expecting the local elections to be fought on the issues of woke, but it is a running problem for the Labour Party insofar as they are considered on those culture war issues, which are very serious issues around women's rights, free speech and all the rest of it, as somehow even more dreadful than the Tories. And that is something to, marvel at.
Yeah, it's quite an incredible feat. I mean, it was interesting. There was a sort of leaked note from Labour advisors saying that Keir could lose the next election on day one if he's still being asked what a woman is, because it's amazing, frankly, that people can't answer that question, and it says a great deal about the politicians, who can't answer a simple question truthfully because they're scared or whether they genuinely buy into the sort of gender ideology rubbish. I mean, Rakib, one problem for Keir Starmer is that his personal ratings are sort of behind the Labour Party. And often when there are sort of focus groups done, Keir Starmer loves a focus group, we know, but people will say, when people are asked to say what words they associate with Keir, they will say things like dull, boring, uninteresting, no vision, that kind of thing. I mean, that's, no one's flocking to Keir Starmer's arms, are they?
No, and I think it's interesting that I think Rishi Sunak received a great deal of criticism for the results from the right of his party. I actually think that Sunak is the only thing that's really preventing the Tories of having, in terms of getting an absolute hammering in the next general election, if truth be told. If you look at the polling, quite often Sunak's personal ratings are above that of his party. And in some cases, it's the reverse of that when it comes to the Labour Party and Sir Keir Starmer. I think that he's yet to truly articulate an uplifting vision for what Britain could be under a Labour government. Now, of course, he has to focus on the cost of living crisis. I think that has to be his priority. But there has to be also, you have to provide that degree of optimism to say it's not always going to be like this. That when we tackle the cost of living crisis, there are better times ahead. So I think at the moment that's the problem. I think that if all you're offering is doom and gloom, you are naturally going to perceive to be a quite dull, uninspiring character. Now, that's not to say that you should have your head in the clouds and be unreasonably positive. I think that Boris Johnson at times fell into that category. But I think many British voters would appreciate more of the sort of big picture stuff from Sir Keir Starmer, and at the moment I don't think they've received much of that.
I think talking about that kind of big picture stuff, the idea of having values or an ideology, that seems to be the problem for actually both Keir and Sunak. They are both kind of two technocrats, essentially, fighting over the centre ground, not saying much, not promising very much, delivering even less.
No, I think that's exactly right, and I think this would be a very different contest between these two leaders of the two main parties if it wasn't for, as I say, the sort of suicide mission that the Tory party has been on for some time, insofar as it's kind of roundabout of leaders and so on. It'd be a very different kind of proposition if you just had these two kind of competing flavours of blancmange on a slightly more equal footing without all of that baggage already being kind of built up for Sunak in particular. But I think it's also a reminder that Keir Starmer is essentially trying to win the next election by default.
Yeah.
And he's doing so well in the knowledge that all of the shenanigans around the Tory party, all of the squandering of their sort of Brexit mandate, all of the infighting, all of the economic chaos that unfurled in response to Liz Truss's government and so on, really gives him a head start in that race. But at the same time, he's almost trying to not say anything about the big particular issues of the day. You get the sense that on some of these big culture war issues, what he'd love to happen is for the Tories to sort of legislate them away so that he can quietly never touch them again. You get the sense that he doesn't have much conviction about anything in particular, his recent U-turn on tuition fees being only the sort of most recent and in some respects kind of prosaic example of the sort of his ability to just sort of ping from one particular position to another. So it's particularly uninspiring, but I also think it is depressing for the state of politics insofar as not only do you not have much competition between the two, but you also have that kind of profound cynicism of, at least we'll win by default, rather than even trying to carve out some kind of response to the electoral ruptures of recent years and what they meant and what they displayed that people wanted out of their politics. So it's going to, whatever happens, it'll be interesting, but you can't help but feel that the choice that we're being presented with is as dreary as that we were seeing back in the 2010s and so on.